Naui is a student activist. She's from Mexico. She is an active member of the Campaign Against Racism and Fascism, and she's a member of Socialist Alternative, which is one of the groups that makes up the United Front, that is the Campaign Against Racism and Fascism. So please, everybody, welcome Naui.
Well, I was actually in Mexico after Trump's victory was announced, and I think one of the best ways to describe the feeling over there was shock and anger. People in Mexico and around the world were shocked that someone who ran on an explicit campaign demonizing migrants, singling out Mexicans as criminals and rapists, promising to build a wall between the border of Mexico and the US, a candidate who talked about sexually assaulting women on television, was elected as president. And I think that, growing up in Mexico means that you are used to a level of racism by the government, who usually try and paper over, their racism with, growing intakes of immigrants and things like that. But I think, that migrants are especially, criminalized for just wanting to have a better life. So a lot of them, try and achieve this by going into the US illegally. We know that once they get there, they are in incredibly precarious jobs because, you don't have papers to actually access anything over there. So I think on the one hand, people have this feeling that, the kind of racism that the governments have to offer is always there. And I think that, this happens because we continue to live in a society that, puts the needs of the rich before human need. So when Trump was elected, I think he immediately began with his crusade against immigrants. So he tried to shut down the sanctuary cities and specifically targeted these cities to try and stop them from resisting the raids and deportations. And he wanted to make an example out of these cities. So ICE continues to specifically target activists who speak out against the level of racism and just the cruelty of the treatment of migrants over there. And, just the targeting and the deportations have, continued to grow as Trump's election, came in. There have also been a number of laws that have been legislated in direct response to protests that erupted after Trump was elected. So initially, these laws came in response to Black Lives Matter, in response to Standing Rock, the resistance against the pipeline. And some of the examples of the bills that they were trying to introduce was that if you protest at a bridge or things like that, if a car hit you, it would be completely fine and you would actually not get charged for hitting a protester, which is, absolutely outrageous. And this did not pass, to be fair, but I think the fact that these things are even thought of just kind of shows you the beast that we're up against. And I think the response of these policies against these movements, there's something familiar about them. And I think that they are familiar because, these movements actually erupted under Obama. So, Obama was called deporter-in-chief for his record numbers of deportations. He deported more than 2.5 million immigrants. So actually when, Trump says that he wants to deport 3 million immigrants, he's, talking about adding onto Obama's initial figures. And I think it's important to also see the ties between these two administrations because, Trump doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It's a continuation of, the levels of repression that Americans saw under Obama, specifically, Muslims and immigrants, but really just the general workers. But I also think that Trump represents something different. With Trump entering the arena, he has managed to officialize racist discourse in society and has actually brought it to the fore. He has managed to piss off large sections of Capitol, but at the same time, he's also abandoning that to try and, hopefully try and kind of like, push away the hostility that's been between them. I think that that Trump also represents something different. And I think that, the thing that sticks out the most of Trump being elected has actually been the massive resistance that we've seen in the U.S. Like, it's the first time that we have seen ever, protests like erupting at 4 a.m. When Trump was elected. It's the first time in a really long time that we've seen like mass mobilizations of the levels of the Women's March. That was millions of people coming out in complete outrage and opposition to everything that Trump represents. So yeah, you see on the one hand, a massive unpopular candidate, and really, the election, throughout the elections, like 2 of the most unpopular candidates, and the winning of an open, far-right candidate win. But you also have this amazing resistance erupt. And I think that, both of those things have had an impact in Australia. So in Australia alone, when Trump signed the immigration ban that, barred people from entering the US from 7 Muslim-majority countries, regardless of whether or not they had already been vigorously and viciously screened by the governments, that also barred Muslims that already had green cards, that had been living in the U.S. for, decades in some different cases. Like Scott Morrison here in Australia actually supported the Muslim ban and said the following: "Our nation's borders protection policies are the envy of the world. The rest of the world would love to have our borders and the way they are secured and the immigration arrangements we have put in place." Scott Morrison said Australia was the most successful immigration country in the world, and the reason we are is because we have got strong borders. Really, the rest of the world is catching up to Australia now. So that was Scott Morrison's response to the Muslim ban. Yeah. And at the same time that this was happening, Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said that she was confident that the Australian and US governments will continue to support each other in ensuring that we can implement our strong immigration and border protection policies. So I'm just going to let that sink in a little bit because, I think every time we hear a politician say strong immigration, we know that this actually means, more Islamophobia, more raids in Muslim communities, more policing of African youth, and more torture in refugee camps. This is what they're actually saying. So Malcolm Turnbull's response to Trump's election was actually quite silent. So a lot of the media tried to get responses or any kind of comments out of him. And I think this was, a bit of a interesting situation because even in the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament, they passed a motion branding Trump as a revolting slug after his lewd comments about women came to light. And even Tony Abbott was able to, string some words together, calling Trump's positions reasonable enough. So this is, again, the politicians in Australia's response to Trump getting in. And I think it is also no surprise that the election of Trump has emboldened sections of Australia's far right and has actually managed to mobilize them. So the likes of Pauline Hanson, like Alison has already said, Cory Bernardi, George Christensen, have risen to the stage as kind of like mini Trumps, looking to implement some of the same policies, if not similar, vicious anti-Muslim policies. So Hanson in particular has, voiced her admiration of Trump and even, opened some champagne bottles when Trump got elected. And, she's an avid supporter of Trump, and that's, not exactly surprising because we knew that, throughout his campaign. But when the Muslim ban came out, this was seen as a bit soft on Trump's side, according to Hansen. So she tweeted the following: President Trump's protection against Islamic extremism are a good start, but I would go further and include Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. The people of America have elected Donald Trump because they wanted to regain control of their borders and protect themselves against the influence and threat of radical Islamic terrorism. Our politicians can no longer sit by and ignore the fact that unless we do something like ban Islamic immigration, Australia will continue to face an ever-increasing threat from Islamic terror. So that was Pauline Hanson's response to, a mild, Muslim ban in her eyes. And I think with, this and other forms of racism coming from the very top in our society, with the media that, attempts to either hide or excuse these facts of racism, it's unsurprising that racist views are common in Australia today. Researchers at the University of Western Sydney recently completed one of the most comprehensive surveys about racism in Australia. And their findings were that 1 in 5 people experienced racism in the past 12 months. Of Muslim women, 77% experienced racism on public transport or on the streets. 65% of Indigenous people have been abused or otherwise disrespected on racial grounds. 10% of those surveyed admit to holding racist views. Specific attitudes are even worse. So 43% admit to anti-African sentiment and 32% hold negative views towards Muslims. So, I think that, this research kind of shows the, culmination of the years of fear-mongering and broad anti-Muslim sentiment in public and, political discourse in Australian society that has been heavily pushed down by the Liberal government. So we see the United Patriots Front, Reclaim Australia, kind of rising through the re-emergence of Pauline Hanson. These groups feel comfortable and emboldened to actually come out and spew their racism because, their messages are already being broadcasted 24/7 by the Liberal media and have been given, a legitimacy by Hanson actually having a position in the Senate. So this has amplified their racist sentiment that the government has fostered for decades. On one hand, we see the transformation of groupings like Reclaim Australia be able to unite more than 1,000 racists at a rally in 2015. We have seen the transformation of their movement go from concerned moms and dads to kind of open fascists calling for a picture of Hitler to be hung and, for his book to actually be taught in every school, which is, absolutely outrageous. But today they can't even, bring together 100 fascists because there has been, massive mobilizations by anti-racist activists here in Melbourne. And that is not because, they haven't just their, supporters haven't just gone home because the Liberal media has condemned them as racist and fascist. It's been because there's been activists on the ground that have mobilized and that see exactly what they represent and see the threat of them actually growing in a period where, the Liberal government is giving them complete terrain to actually grow and, foster this kind of sentiment. While maybe today they don't actually manage to bring all of these people on the ground, their Facebook pages keep getting more likes and more likes today. So it's not to say that these sentiments, as the research from Sydney's University shows, these sentiments are still poignant in our society, but they're still just, on, the internet side of it. Which brings me to what CARF does. And as Alison said, CARF is, a grouping that was formed in 2015, specifically with the aim of combating the far right and, stopping them from growing. This includes groups like Socialist Alternative, Anarchist Affinity, Freedom Socialist Party, as well as a number of anti-racist activists that are unaffiliated. And I think that, CUF has been important to actually stopping these organizations because, we have Pauline Hanson emerge, we have Trump emerge, we have Marine Le Pen in France. So I think that even though we don't see as many people mobilizing today, this is still sentiments that are there, because there's been a stat that was released that Pauline Hanson's support actually increased from 16% to 23% in just 3 months from her being elected. So she's actually gaining more popularity. So it's not that the threat of the far right has completely been smashed in Australia. I think that because of the political situation around the world that Nancy's going to be talking about, these, I guess, ideas are still out there. And I think if we want to see them actually disappear, we need to actually combat them and physically stop them from spreading. And I think that, by these figures legitimizing this through Parliament, through, I guess, legitimate vehicles, these people will continue to come back. And I think that that is something that we need to be determined, because I think Trump represents the fact that, society doesn't just progress forward because, that's just the natural progression of society. I think Trump, kind of represents the opposite, that, actually, if we don't have people on the street pushing things in a progressive direction, that's actually not going to happen. And I think that's kind of the great things of the opposition that's being shown in the U.S. brings to the fore, that there's actually, a serious opportunity to fight that. And I think that we need to have that here in Australia too. Leave it there.
Thank you very much, Naui, for that contribution on behalf of CAF.